I am happy to introduce tonight and have with us Robert McKersie, Professor Emeritus of the MIT Sloan School of Management, an Arlingtonian, as well as the author of a new book from Southern Illinois University Press, A Decisive Decade, an Insider's View of the Chicago Civil Rights Movement during the 1960s.
Good to be here.
Thank you for being on.
Thanks, Peter.
I have to say that I found your book insightful and important. Although we're looking at a decade 50 years ago, you weren't expecting, I gather, in retirement to be writing a book about your experience in 1960 Chicago. So please tell us how that evolved.
Well, I had the notes from my involvement in the civil rights movement during the 60s, and we'll talk a little bit about the different things that I did.
Sure.
And I thought they were just going to be stashed away for the archives. And then when I had some time on my hands, I said, look, maybe I can elaborate these a little bit, flesh them out. And then I started to make trips back to Chicago. I had time. I was quasi-retired to talk to people to help elaborate, some of the episodes that I had seen firsthand. But I wanted to give a little bit more, context.
Sure.
And since I'm basically an academic, I also wanted to anchor them into some of the other books that have been written about some of the same things that I had participated in.
Back to 1959, you had graduated from Harvard Business School. You got an appointment at University of Chicago.
Right.
So you, in a sense, you were there at the very dawn of the 60s in Chicago, and not necessarily expecting to get involved in this burgeoning civil rights movement. So how did you get involved both in academia and teaching at UChicago, as well as in the civil rights movement as it started there in the 60s?
Well, it was a kind of step-by-step journey. I was teaching a course in collective bargaining. I had a student who was studying a strike by some African-American workers at 2 local hospitals. And that was mainly my early field of labor management relations. The workers had struck because management wouldn't recognize them. And I got really interested in the leadership and the cause that they were pursuing, which was partly labor relations, partly, in a sense, uplifting, in a sense, the status of African Americans. So that was the first step. And then through the church where I was very active, I met several leaders of what was the developing civil rights movement in Chicago. And they said, hey, Bob, you've got some skills, help us strategize some of our campaigns. So one by one, I sort of got involved in some of the campaigns.
A bit of a historical background, though. Certainly, for many of us, from a historical standpoint, we think of Chicago really as a place where Black Americans sought refuge from the bitter racism of the South. But certainly in 1960s, Chicago, I think you remarked in the book, was the most segregated large city in the United States. So how do those two visions of Chicago square?
Well, I think it came about with the development of the steel industry and meatpacking and some of the other industries that pulled workers from the South who were looking for opportunities. And they came in tremendously large numbers during the early years of the 1900s, 1920, 1930, and so on. And I don't think there was enough housing around the general area of Chicago, so they sort of piled up on 2 sides, the south side and west sides of Chicago, just filling up these existing buildings. Some of them originally in white areas, but then the whites started to move away, moving further out. So the blacks became, in a sense, the sort of workforce, the labor force of Chicago. And there was also a lot of efforts to keep them in those areas and not let them, in a sense, go to the north side of Chicago.
One of the challenges, I imagine, and I think you draw it out well in A Decisive Decade, is that your real entree into the civil rights movement seemed to be the church that you were a part of, the First Unitarian Church of Chicago, as well as the University of Chicago.
Right.
Both largely white establishment organizations.
Right.
And the question being, how were they perceived by the civil rights movement, by the members, the rank and file members of the civil rights movement, and thereby how were you perceived as a person working in those organizations?
Well, starting with the University of Chicago, the perception of the university was not too good within the black community or on the part of the leaders. In fact, there was a community organization just to the south of the university that was constantly challenging the university to do more for that community. And one of the first events of the civil rights movement in Chicago was a sit-in by students against the administration of the university because they were not renting in their apartments that they owned nearby to African Americans. So the university was not seen in a good light, at least in the early 1960s. So my presence as a professor coming from the university did create, in a sense, some questions. The Unitarian Church was quite different. It was very integrated. And as I mentioned, the reason I got into the movement was that there were a couple of the key leaders of what was then the developing movement, very active in the church. We had this discussion group, and we were discussing like that sit-in by the students at the university and other issues that were developing. So being a member of the church was not a bar. In fact, that was my gateway into the movement.
Okay.
In fact, what became really the nerve center of the movement, a coordinating council, you know, that strategized and, in a sense, developed all of the demonstrations and protests, that was made up of church groups. And something I think that needs to be said is that the civil rights movement of the 60s would not have, in a sense, made the mark it did without clergy, without ministers. They were the ones, in a sense, who really gave it the kind of the moral underpinning. So the Unitarian Church was a plus, actually.
The beginning of the 60s, you're a new member of the U Chicago faculty.
Right.
You're, as you could say in the book, you're, quote, bucking for tenure. And my sense is there's got to be some tension around securing that tenure and securing the good graces of the university, and at the same time being true to your sense of where the civil rights movement and your place in it needs to go. How did you resolve that tension?
Well, you're putting your finger on a really big dichotomy between what people expected I would be doing as a young assistant professor, teaching and doing research, and then my activities in the civil rights movement. And I got a lot of people saying, hey, Bob, are your priorities right? You're endangering your chances for tenure, not just because I was taking time away from what they saw, you know, as the right priorities, but also because I might, in a sense, get my name in the newspaper if I got arrested or something, and that would quickly say to them, hey, this guy isn't really serious about an academic career. He's off, you know, on this crusade. So it was. And I had to think hard about that over the years, Peter, because it was a real dilemma.
It strikes me that from what you wrote, maybe a turning point of sorts was 1963. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Was in jail. He writes Letter from Birmingham Jail, and this is his clarification.
Right.
What is going on? Why it is that Black America needs to make a statement at this time in this way. Can you speak to how Letter from Birmingham Jail clarified for you that which is very difficult, if not impossible, for white Americans to know, and that is the experience of Black Americans?
The experience, and also I think the urgency to get on with change. I mean, so often people had been told, well, change is happening, and there had been some improvement. I mean, President Truman had integrated the armed forces, and there was the decision, you know, Brown versus et cetera, that was in the 50s. So people were saying, you know, be patient. And King was saying, look, the problems, the discrimination, you know, is so intense, so big, that we just can't be patient. And we've got to get on, and we've got to be provocative. I mean, I think one of the things he was trying to say to other ministers who really believed, you know, in discussion and conciliation, I'm going to have to, in a sense, flash out the opposition. I'm going to have to, in a sense, make things tense, make things, in a sense, unpleasant. And that's the only way we're going to get changed.
How do you come down on the civil rights movement and its impact on Chicago and the situation of Black Americans there?
Well, the way I think I would answer that question, Peter, is that the civil rights movement moved through different targets. One target, of course, was employment, trying to open up more jobs for African Americans. And I was heavily involved in a campaign against one large company that obviously was discriminating against black workers who were there seeking employment. I think there we made quite a bit of progress. And I think the business community, even thinking about that since the 60s, has probably moved very well in terms of being inclusive and welcoming people of color. The second target area was education, where the minority kids were all piled up in neighborhood schools, and rather than letting them move over to white schools where there are vacancies, they brought in these trailers called Willis wagons after superintendent of schools Willis. There, we didn't make as much progress. The superintendent just stuck to neighborhood policy, and he was backed by Mayor Daley, and nothing really changed for the moment. And I think even today, education is a big challenge in Chicago. When we moved to housing, which was the focus that Martin Luther King brought when he came in the summer of 1966, they did reach a summit agreement that committed the real estate agencies and the city to try to make more homes open. And I think it is the case in Chicago. If you have the means, I mean, if you have the income, you can live anywhere. You can live in Winnetka. You can live, so there's been some progress there. Now, the fourth area, I think there's been a lot of progress, and that was with Jesse Jackson's Operation Breadbasket organization, where he wanted to open up shelf space for a lot of these small suppliers. People who are making wax, drain cleaner, Joe Louis milk, interesting name to put on a milk product. There we also saw a lot of progress, both for those companies as well as for workers going into those retail stores. So I think you have to, in a sense, break it down, and I would say, yes, quite a bit of progress. There are some people who have written about it when they look at all of the demonstrations and the rallies, and they say, what did we get for it? And they're a little more pessimistic, maybe because I was close to it and working hard to have some of these things make a difference. I may be a little bit more optimistic, a little bit more biased.
Well, I think certainly in the area of consciousness, the decade did a lot to move things.
Well, and if you go to the national level, I mean, I was focusing primarily on what could be related to the action of the civil rights movement. I mean, we got a number of key pieces of legislation. In 1965, we got the Civil Rights Act. 1966, we got the Voting Rights Act, which has been in newspapers recently because there's been some efforts to kind of weaken some of the provisions. We did not get the Housing Act in 1967 when it was first proposed, but unfortunately, it took Martin Luther King's death in 1968, and then it was passed. Then we got, at the national level, a Fair Housing Act. So you can say the 60s gave us some legislation, gave us some new laws that have made a difference.
You're bringing up Martin Luther King there. Brings me back to one of the passages in the book that I found particularly meaningful, and that is at your church's memorial service for Dr. King. You were agitated. I think it's fair to say that that's sort of the characterization you gave your feeling there, that any eulogy provided by a white member of the Unitarian congregation could not possibly capture the sense of loss that was experienced then, there, as well as across the country, I would imagine. And at the same time, it would have been impossible for a black American to speak to the congregation and really tell it like it was. That the etiquette of the day would have not allowed that. So I'm wondering if half a century later, if we can say that we've learned at all how to bridge this rift and understand a little bit more about how it is to be in someone else's skin. Do you think we've made progress in this?
We've made some progress, Peter, but we have to think what was going on with the Trayvon Martin and the gentleman, Mr. Zimmerman, who was acquitted, because I think a lot of whites, and to some extent myself, you know, it was very hard for us to put ourselves in the shoes of this young man, Trayvon Martin. And it took President Obama to speak up and say, look, I could have been Trayvon Martin. You folks don't realize that when someone of a person of color walks down the street, the clicks go on the door locks of their cars, or people cross the street. So it's so hard for us. So here we are, you know, 2013, and the gap is much more subtle. It's based on assumptions. It's based on things that are very hard to talk about.
And let me interrupt and say, relative to this, because I saw on the WBUR website a beautiful piece that you wrote in commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington. And one of the pullouts there was, as a nation, we're past the need to discuss things like separate drinking fountains. But when it comes to talking about young black men in hooded sweatshirts, we still have a long way to go.
It's often, I mean, we had a commission that our President Bill Clinton commissioned. We had John Hope Franklin, a distinguished black historian who chaired a commission back when Clinton was president. And the whole theme of it was, how do we have a conversation across the racial divide? How do we do that? So it's proximity, it's integration, it's conversations, and it's patience.
Right. So after your experience in Chicago in the 60s and subsequently, you are hopeful that we can continue to make progress.
It's a work in progress. Yeah, absolutely. We just need to continue. Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, the book is A Decisive Decade. I would personally recommend the book rack on Medford Street in Arlington. I know they can order it for you if they don't have it. I talked to them. Also, certainly Amazon and BarnesandNoble.com, et cetera, et cetera. The author is Robert McKersie. Thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate it.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you, Peter.
Absolutely. I'm sure our viewers will as well. And I'm Peter Bermudes for Arlington Public News. Thanks for joining us.